Right. So today in session 2, we're going to talk about what is HTML5. Now, before that, we are going to revise what we did in module 1, just to give an overview and be at the same level of what we are expected to be. So on the first day, which is the first session, we covered what is web programming. So we talked about different technologies for web programming. So we said HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as a trio form the foundations of web programming. And it is something which is used to create web applications. So we used to create web applications only by using HTML earlier, then we graduated to using CSS, and then we used JavaScript, right? So JavaScript was something which added dynamicism. So yesterday, using a Visual Studio Code tool, we also went ahead and created our first HTML page, right? And we said, okay, this is how an HTML page looks like, and we can run it using a live server in the browser. So we are using Chrome as the browser, Google Chrome, but we can use any of the other browsers which are available in the market. So we'll be using all different browsers for testing purposes. So we'll be using Firefox, Mozilla, we'll be using Opera, we'll be using Internet Explorer, we'll be using Edge. So all these are different browsers on which we're going to test our HTML5 applications, right? So to talk about today's session, what we are going to talk about is what HTML5 is. So yesterday we talked about what HTML was, right? So if you remember, we went ahead, just to revise, we went ahead and created a simple HTML page, which was the hello HTML.html, which had some HTML tags content within it. So we said HTML is nothing but a language that consists of tags, and we are having these as page tags content inside it, which can occur only once in your document. So we specify this HTML page is nothing but a document which consists of some structure, and it consists of some tags that we have written in, right? Then we also went ahead and validated our HTML, saying that header 1 was not the correct HTML element, whereas h1 is. So we saw the error that we got by using this pasted thing into the validation of HTML, and we said HTML was not valid if you are not using the right tags. It means the browser requires predefined set of tags, and the browser is the one that this HTML will be understood by, right? Now, today's session, we're going to talk about HTML5. So let's see what this HTML5 brings to the table. Now, before we start, this course is brought to you by OdinSchool, which is a technology upskilling platform, and we help you to continuously acquire new skills so that you stay skilled and stay ahead. Now, to talk about me, I'm Sumit Vijay Vajpayee. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I'm delivering trainings on JavaScript technologies right from its inception. I am an Angular, React, Node expert, and other include MongoDB, Node, AI, machine learning, and GraphQL. Right. So let's understand why we learn HTML5. Now, why we learn HTML5 is because HTML5 is the latest standard. Now, what do you mean by that? When I say HTML is the latest standard, it means HTML5 is the latest specification. Okay, I still didn't understand. HTML5 is the latest version of HTML. So do we have versions of HTML? Yes, we do. And right from its inception, when www, which was the World Wide Web, and we call it as the internet, was born in 1990s, we specified that HTML is going to have these tags content inside it. So HTML came as a specification. So when you talk about a specification is nothing but a set of rules which contains the rules for a particular language, right? So there are different specifications, out of which HTML5 is also a specification. So it contains some set of rules that the browsers must follow in order to have that content to be understood by the browser, right? So that's why we learn HTML5. But why are we focusing on 5 as a version? The reason is because 5 has come up with some major features that were lacking in the web earlier. So if you briefly see how the web evolved, okay, as we talked about the things yesterday, so we had HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as the three trio forming the foundations of the web. Now, when you talk about HTML5, which is an evolved version of HTML, right, which is the latest version of HTML, it is something which is having some new features. Now, why those features were not added right from the start when there was the internet booming? Now, when internet was born, we didn't have these features in mind. We only used internet or websites for dumping static data and share it across over the internet so that people can see what we do with that website. So if we have products, we will have products information inside it. If we have services, we will have services information inside it. So all those information can be dumped into web pages as we talked about yesterday, and we can put it into a website, and that website is hosted onto a server. Now with this HTML5 evolution, so HTML5 didn't came initially, right? So I said HTML was something which was a standard, but then as the web evolved, so were the expectations from the web. So people started expecting more from the web. So it was not only sufficient for you to dump in some content, some static content. I'm saying static because with HTML, what you tend to create are static contents. What they are, fine. But we want our application to be more responsive. We want our application to be more interactive with the end user. And for this, we used different libraries and frameworks. So let's say instead of just showing the information to the user, you're also wanting to take the information from the user and store it somewhere. Like you are, let's say, Indeed.com, where you are accepting all the details of a particular person who is applying for a job, and then you accept also his resume to be uploaded and store it centrally somewhere. Now HTML didn't help you in doing that, right? HTML also didn't have any way of having any programming logic, and that's the reason why we need to depend on other technologies and other frameworks as well for doing that stuff. Now, as the web evolved, as I said, people started expecting more from the web. So this was okay that using your users' data for storing it onto the server side, maybe there were server-side technologies. So if you have heard of ASP, PHP, .NET, these are all server-side technologies. Okay, so what does this server-side technologies mean? Server-side technologies are those technologies which execute on the server. HTML, as we proved yesterday, we did not need to execute it using a server. We can just open it with a browser. So when I'm using a server-side code, that has to be executed by the browser, which emits out HTML and sends it back to the client. And who is the client? The web browser, right? Now, where does this HTML5 fits into this? Now, if you see about the evolution of the web and also the technologies which evolved, let's say prior to HTML5, let's say 8 years back or 10 years back, if you wanted to show an animation, if you wanted to show a video, HTML alone did not provide you any way apart from the object and the embed tag, which was used by some third-party plugins. If you have heard of the name Flash, Adobe Flash, or if you have heard the name Silverlight. So when 10 years back you wanted to play some animations, when you wanted to play some movie, when you wanted to play some video, audio, any of those, you have to have Flash installed. So I'm not very sure if you remember those days where it would pop out something to be installed on your machine, and you have on your browser as a plugin, you need to install Flash. Unless you do that, your Flash content would not be visible. And that's why HTML5 solved these problems. So now with HTML5, you do not need to install Flash or any plugin for viewing any content. So the animation stuff that we were talking about is solved by HTML5 new features. For example, using Canvas, for example, using SVG. So we're going to talk about that as we move ahead. Also, if you talk about other things that HTML5 has brought up, so if you say, let's say some audio has to be played, some video has to be played, you don't have to depend on Flash or Silverlight. You can do it out of the box using HTML5 because there are tags like audio and video given to you out of the box. So why learn HTML? Because that's a latest standard and that has evolved over the years to make the inclusion of the things which were expected from the web, and the web by default did not provide it. So we had to depend on some third-party libraries and plugins So now with HTML5, we don't need to, and that's why you should be learning HTML5. Right. So what's the agenda? HTML5, how do we got here? So as I said, there are different versions of HTML. We didn't start it off with HTML5, but yes, we started off with HTML somewhere. Then what are the new features of HTML5? Now we're going to talk about the new features from both perspectives, including the JS, without including the JS. I'll talk about them when we arrive there. Then the current state of browser support. Now this point is kind of important because when we talk about the current state of browser support, we need to understand that HTML5 is a standard, and when it's a standard, it is supported by most of the browsers. Now, why am I not saying it's supported by all the browsers? Because every browser has its own implementation of the engine that we call as view engine. For example, if you talk about Google, Google Chrome uses an engine called as V8, fine, which is basically a rendering engine, fine, and JavaScript executing engine. Now there, it implements most of the things which are given to you by HTML5. But other browsers, which are older browsers, they do not have support for the latest features of HTML5. So now, obvious question would be there in your mind. Okay, so if there are browsers who are not supporting the current features of it, how do I tackle it? Yes, we have a solution for that as well. So we'll talk about it at the end of the session, right? So let's move on with our agenda. So as we discussed on what HTML5 is, HTML5 is the latest evolution of the standard that defines HTML, right? Now, what do you mean by this standard? It's nothing but a specification. It's nothing but a set of rules. It's nothing but a document which basically contains the rules that the browser must be following so that they understand what HTML5 provides them, right? So that's what HTML5 is. So when we briefly talk about HTML, we talk about HTML5 in today's world because that's something which is having an importance, right? Now we don't have any later versions after HTML5. Yes, we have some minor versions of 5.x. We are going to talk about them as well, but we don't have 6.x as of now, right? So the what is there is currently the 5.x version kicking in. Fine. So how did we reach this stage? How did we have HTML5 evolved over the years? Now, if you see about, now we didn't start it off with HTML as a thing. Here I just started with HTML2, which just went ahead in 1995. To be specific, on November 1995, that's where the standard was, right? So HTML2 was born on 1995. Okay, but we all obviously know HTML came way before that. Okay, but I'm not talking about the 1.x version, but I'm talking about, let's say, the 2.x version that is there. Then 1997, you had HTML3, which included some more features, fine. And you have HTML4.x, 4.01 to be there in 1999, right? So till 1999, you had HTML4.01. Now, after 1999 till 2014, fine, or if you're in, let's say, 2010, and if you ask a developer what version of HTML he is working with, he would say, I do not know the version, because we never focused on the version of HTML before HTML5. So if you just ask him, he would say, I know HTML, but I don't know the version that I'm working with because I never cared about the version that I'm working with. And from 1999, there was no major version which was evolved over the years. And you can see from 1999 till today, there are many changes, fine, which the web has gone through, right? So when you say, okay, that these are the features which I am expecting from the web, but the web is right now not having these features, so I may be using some browser, I'll be using some frameworks, I'll be using some libraries or plugins to solve that. But when HTML5 kicked in, now HTML5 got released on 2014, but it's not the fact that it was initiated in 2014. It was initiated in 2007. It was written as a draft. It was a working draft. and in 2007 the working draft had all the rules that are expected, and they gathered all the information that what's expected from the web and what is the web missing, right? So all this information they gathered, they put it in a draft, and then they came up with some new features that HTML5 can provide. So HTML5, yes, it's a newer version of HTML, and it's a specification. It's having some set of rules. We're going to have a look at the set of rules which are there with HTML5, and we're going to see what is the documentation that's going to have the set of rules in HTML5. Right now, versions of HTML5. Okay, in the previous slide you talked about different versions of HTML, right, from 2, 3, 4.01 till 5. But do we have versions of HTML5 as well? Yes. If you see the version 5.x 5.0, first draft was there in 2007 as we talked about. Then there was a candidate recommendation in 2012, and then the final recommendation in 2014, right? Then you have HTML 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. So there is still 5.3 as a first draft which is there in the draft mode, and there are some new features which are expected to be there in the 5.3 version of it, right? So with each version you have some new features added to the HTML version. Now we don't always say that I'm working with versions of HTML 5.3 or 5.2. We just say we are working with HTML5, right? That's how you just communicate, saying that HTML5 is the latest version of HTML, and that's the latest version of the standard that HTML5 implements. Fine. So let's understand the spec, which is the specification. So if you search into Google, I've just done it for you. So if you search in Google for HTML5 specification, now do not click the first link which is showing you HTML5 2014 till this, because that's an older version of it. You can go back to the second link, which is dev.w3.org, and then opening up this link, which will open up this URL. Okay, so this page is what gets opened up. Now here you can go back and actually have a look at n number of things with this HTML, right? So you can see last updated 1st October 2020, which is today, right? So you can see this in different versions of it. One page version, okay? You can see multi-page version, fine, as in multi-page syntax from the URL. You can see the developer version, PDF version. So there are different versions that you can use in, and as well you can also see what are the new features that this specification provides. So can you see semantic structure and API of HTML documents, elements of HTML, fine, then user interaction, loading web pages, web applications, API, communication, for example, the WebSocket, web workers. So web workers are a new feature of HTML5. Web stories, that's also a new feature of HTML5. So all of these are nothing but the new things which HTML5 is bringing to the table. Now, if you want to go into much of the details, you can specifically go back and have a look at this URL and then see what these other details mean. Fine, so you have things specifically from each of different things which are there, like you can see dates and times, okay, like month, local time, global weeks and all, because that's being a new input type that's HTML5 brings you. So we're going to talk about new things that HTML5 brings to the table, but right now we are talking about the specification. So this is the location where you would find extra information about what HTML5 specification is. So if you want to know more on what HTML5 specification is and what are the new features, you can just go back into this documentation. Right? So that's how you basically talk about using HTML5. Okay, so I understand HTML5 is the latest version of HTML as a standard, and I understand I have to learn it because it provides me with new major features and that are used into the web for a better user experience. So that's what we are always striving for. We are always striving for our application to have a better user experience with the end user. Fine, we need our application to be performant. The more frameworks you use, more slower your application gets, and that's how HTML cuts down the dependency and provides the things out of the box, right? Now, you have some major features which HTML5 brings to the table, But I've divided these major features with and without JS, meaning things which are being displayed onto this presentation on this slide. Those are the features that we're going to talk about in the coming sessions, right? Now, why am I saying without JS? Because you can work with these elements or with these new major features without using JavaScript, right? So you can use semantic tags. If you remember, we had looked at semantic tags as a section yesterday, which were a collection of tags that we saw, programming tags. Okay, you had the formatting tags and all that we covered on yesterday. Semantic tags are new features in HTML5. Then you also have the new input types. Fine. So we'll talk about input types as a whole. Fine. Input type equal to text creates a text box. Fine. Input type equal to date creates a calendar control. So input type equal to date is a newer input type with your HTML5. Right. You have several other input types as well. Right. You do have input types which are date, week, you have color, fine, you have range, you have n number of different input types, and we're going to cover them in the further sessions, practically seeing the hands-on how do they appear in the browser, right? Then the next part or next features which we need to discuss on are new attributes. New attributes meaning HTML. Now we saw what attributes were. Attributes are extra information about the element. So element is nothing but the tag, that's what we saw, and attributes are extra information about the element, and they tell you how this element is going to behave. So there are some properties, some attributes which you can set for the element, and that element will be reading those attributes, and the browser will be displaying those details into the UI, right? Then we also discussed on audio and video. So now you don't need to have the dependency on Flash or Silverlight for having any audio, any video, any animation to be played in, right? You can just work with audio and video tag out of the box, and we are exclusively going to make, and we are going to have an in-depth detail about working with audio and video tags. So how do you create an audio tag? How do you create a video tag? How do you embed a video tag in your UI? How do we have support for different codecs which are there? How do we know that which browser supports which codecs? Then can we have a support for captions and subtitles as well? Yes. So all of those we're going to talk about in a section where we see some new features of HTML5 practically being implemented, right? Now, as of today, we're going to talk about some new major features which have come up, right? Without seeing it practically, because these are going to be dealt in depth for, and they're kept for the further sessions to come in. Now, the next part is SVG. So SVG, which is Scalable Vector Graphics, is new in HTML5. So that allows you to have images, text, which are much more crisper in the UI. So if the user is trying to zoom in, or if the user is trying to zoom out, your image or the text, if you have written it via SVG, that will still be more crispier than what it was maybe on a previous end. So when SVG was not there, we had difficult times in you loading different images at different point of time, maybe depending on different devices, right? So SVG provides us so scalable vector graphics. So support for SVG is new. SVG as a concept is not new with HTML5. Let me remind you that, because we use SVG even without HTML5. So HTML5 gives you support for SVG to be integrated in the web browser. Prior to this, there was no out-of-the-box support of the scalable vector graphics, find the images or anything which you are drawing onto it. So now with SVG, you can draw something onto your browser. So you can draw rectangles, arcs, some heavy animations which can be done, and you can do it irrespective of whether the user is zooming in or zooming out, because scalable vector graphics, the SVG, does it for you. So these are some major features without JS. Now these are the major features with JS, meaning it's not only the new tags that HTML5 gives you, but it also gives you some programming APIs, meaning I can go back and use some code in the browser using JavaScript to add these things into my browser. Fine. So what are the new features? Web workers. So let me give an overview of each of these, and maybe when we'll cover JavaScript, okay, we will be talking about these things as well. So web workers are a way of handling multi-threading environment in JavaScript. Now JavaScript is a single threaded runtime. So we cannot have multi-threading by default in JavaScript, but web workers is a step for providing a different execution cycle, a different execution path for your JavaScript code, and that's done by using web workers. So as I said, web workers are an attempt to create a multi-thread environment using HTML5 out of the box. So I don't have to depend on any frameworks. These are supported by the browser. So if the browser supports it, then I am ready to go with my application's UI to work it. Then you have storage APIs. Now, as I said, these features have evolved over the years, right? And as I said, these features were expected from the web out of the box, but were not there. So they were polyfilled by using different libraries and frameworks. So when I say storage API, storage APIs allow me to store some information on the client side. Now, if you talk about the previous existing storage APIs, you had cookies or you had query string. So cookies were some text files where you can store some information onto your client's location, fine, and then you had query strings where you can pass the data into the URL, but that's not always the safest way. And we also had some restrictions, some size restrictions with storage APIs. And that's the reason why with new features of HTML5, the storage APIs, which are local storage, session storage, IndexedDB, and things like that, all these are allowing you to store some information which cookies would not, because cookies were text files and they were also not kind of secured, and we've had the size restrictions there as well. But here with storage APIs, which are new features of HTML5, I can store 5 MB of data per domain, right? I can even request the user to increase the size with the storage APIs as well. Okay? Now, if you imagine, now this is all in accordance to having the data being stored on the client side. Now you would say, what's the requirement? Why do we need to store the data on the client side or in the browser? Now there are numerous applications of it, because what we talk about, we try to create different kinds of application. So we are going to cover these kind of applications as we move ahead. But if you talk about a specialized kind of an application that we say as a single page application, single page application is an application which allows you to make requests to the server, get back the data, and then have the data to be stored on the client side, so that for the next usage, it can use the client side stored data rather than each time going back to the server. Now again, these are client side storage mechanisms. So they are vulnerable to security. All the rules that apply to client side storage also applies to storage API. By default, they store everything in the format of strings. So do not store passwords or do not store sensitive information using storage API. But the information that the user is going to see, let's say for example, I'm going to show list of products to the user. I'm having an online shopping application which basically shows hundreds of products which it got from an HTTP request from the server and wants to store that data onto the client side. So that data can surely be stored in storage API, because there is nothing private into that data as it's going to be shown to the user itself, right? So that's a newer feature. Then we talk about geolocation. Geolocation is another major feature which allows you to know the location of a particular user when he's browsing your application. Now, it's not that I have to tell you that this is kind of an important feature, because even if I don't tell you, you will see most of the applications which you use, they want to know your location, fine, and it is kind of mandatory for most of the applications that you work on. Let's say for example, you work with Pizza Hut, or you order something on the Pizza Hut, so it wants to know your location so that the delivery man can go back and deliver your pizza at a correct location. Then if you are booking an Uber, you have to give the access to Uber to know your location. Until unless you do that, your cab will not be booked. So there are numerous applications of knowing where the user is, because the application itself may be using it, right? So geolocation, which is a new feature with HTML5, is giving you the API for knowing how the user or where the user is and how is going to access your website, and you can get back the coordinates, which is the latitude and the longitude from it, right? That's geolocation. Now it is an API, so all these what we are discussing on has to be done using coding, using JavaScript. So you have to write some code, and with JavaScript only these can be achieved, because these are not tags, these are APIs. Next comes service worker. Now you will see, okay, we discussed on web worker, which was an way of creating a multi-thread environment with JavaScript. So is service worker on the same lines? Yes, but I'll say the application of service worker is different than the web worker. It is kind of a web worker. It is a specialized web worker that you're using, but you use service workers for different usage, for different implementation. So why you use service worker for? Now you use service worker for using push notifications. Use service workers for having offline applications. Fine. So when you talk about service workers, you can use or can give a better user experience to anyone who is kind of offline. So if it is offline, service worker can help you to show a fallback mechanism that he can visit to, and service worker can run as a thread, okay, to encounter the problem that he is facing on. Okay, so that's what basically a service worker is. Now that's a basic. There are n number of other things to talk about in service worker as well, but for offline applications, that's the use of a service worker, right? Then we have Canvas. Canvas, which is again a drawing tool where we can go back and draw something onto the browser. So we had a look at SVG. We discussed on SVG on the last slide, where we say scalable vector graphics is a way of having your things being drawn, like shapes and sizes to be drawn onto it. On the same lines, you have Canvas also to be done. So what's the difference? What's the difference between SVG, which also allows you to draw something on your browser, and Canvas, which also allows you to draw something onto the browser? What's the difference? The difference is Canvas is pixel based. It's raster graphics, whereas SVG is raster based. Fine. So sorry, it's vector based. So SVG, when we say it's a vector based, it can redraw yourself. And when I say Canvas, it's pixel based. It tries to redraw itself, but it cannot scale. Fine. So it is in the form of pixels. That's why when the user zooms something into the canvas or zooms out into the canvas, you don't have that crispness as you get with SVG, right? But there are different applications of canvases as well, like drawing something using MS Paint kind of an application that you want to draw in. So these are kind of things what canvas can be used for. Some animations that you want to play in, some waterfall kind of a model. So there are n number of applications of canvases, and that's not something which has to be neglected of again, right? So these are the major features of HTML5, which came with JS, with API, and which came without JS. Now in this course specifically, we're going to talk about new features which came without JS, because that's our aim. Now for learning web workers, storage APIs, geolocation, service worker, and canvas, we need to understand JavaScript, right? And because we are focusing more on the HTML5 and HTML web programming to get started, we're going to see the features in the further sessions without JS. Right. Now, before we move on to other parts, let's see what else can we do with this feature. So let's discuss on a point, okay, that we specifically said, okay, what if my browser is having some limited period of support for HTML5. So let's say I'm having some HTML5 content to be written in, and my browser may or may not support it. So the first thing is, how do I know if my browser supports it, right? So how do I know if my browser supports it? Now for that, you need to go back to a site which is html5test.com, right? Now this website, which is html5test.com, will analyze your current user agent, which is the client, which is the browser, and it will rate your browser depending on what features the browser supports. So you can know if your current browser is supporting some feature in HTML5 or not. Now you can see your browser scores 473 out of 555 points. Now, if your browser is scoring 473 out of 555 points, that's one of the better browsers to use in, right? Because it's having, now Chrome is a forefront runner of supporting most of the features of HTML5, right? That's why we are going to use Chrome. But as I said, we are also going to use other browsers for testing purposes. Now, if you see, this contains the categories of the new features that HTML5 has brought in, right? Now, if you talk about, we talked about audio video tag, which is there in the multimedia. So yes, it supports the video element, it supports subtitles, fine. Audio track selection is not supported, video track selection is not supported. So the end user cannot select a particular track by default for playing something into the video, right? So poster images, yes. Codec detection is yes. So all these are supported in the current browser. Then you can also talk about audio. You can talk about elements that HTML5 gives you. Find the section elements, grouping elements, the form elements, the new input types, right? So all these are the input types which are kind of supported. Fine. If I talk about streaming, fine. Yes, some media source extensions is by default giving you that. Then responsive images, fine. Who use a picture element, that's new with images. Then we have web components, that's another specification that's also new with HTML5. Then 2D graphic, okay, canvas 2D drawing, you can see canvas as a part, support for it. Then using output and input elements, fine, using that. Web applications, storage APIs, session storage, local storage, yes, that's supported. Now all these are different new things. So from a script perspective, what are the new things? Like you have ES6, which is the latest standard for JavaScript. These are also supported. So you can see all the new features that are supported or not supported by your browser. Now currently we are testing it only on this browser, which is Chrome, Google Chrome. But now what if I want to check this on other browsers? So I can do that. I can just go back to Microsoft Edge. I'll just paste my html5test.com. Now you see 473. That's the same score that you get with Edge as well, right? So you have Edge being supporting all the features that Chrome is also supporting in, right? But if you see other features, like if I go back to Firefox, let me arrange this. So with Firefox Mozilla, if I go back to html5test.com, it'll again detect what features are supported by the current browser and would rate your browser with the points. So you can see it's 466 points, right, as compared to 473. So your Chrome and your Edge is supporting most of the features of HTML5, whereas your Mozilla is having 466 as the point being rated out. And if you, I always have, so you can go back and check for Opera, you can check for other things as well. I'm just going to put it into the Internet Explorer, which is IE11. So I'm using an Internet Explorer IE11 version. I'm going to paste html5test.com, and if you just see, if you compare, it's running the tests, and you can see the score is well below what other browsers are giving, right? So I stands for 312 points, then you have 473 each for Edge and Chrome, and you have 466 points for Mozilla as well. So this is how you can check if your current browser supports features of HTML5, and how many features. If you want to specifically have a look at that, as I've told you, you can specifically do it by having a look at each of these. I'll just close down. specifically looking at the video element, what it supports, having a look at the audio element, or maybe if I want to see if the input types are supported or not. Fine, these are the things. Now if you have a look at, let me do it with IE again. Let me go back and specify, because the next portion that we're going to discuss on is actually based on to the discussion that we're going to have right now. So in IE, as you saw the score, which is 300 odd, 312 to be very specific. If I scroll down, now this is in Internet Explorer. If I scroll down, you can see the support. So if I just put this side by side so that you can compare. So on the left, I'm having Chrome. On the right, I'm having IE. Now in the forms section, if you compare, Chrome is supporting most of the forms except for input type equal to 5, even that's the partial support being there. And if you compare IE, you do have input type equal to date not being supported. Type equal to month, week, time, date, time, local, not supported. Color, not supported. Right? So you see, different browsers do implement different features. Now you as a developer may be thinking, okay, right now you told me a way of understanding how do I make use of HTML5 test.com to know if my browser is supporting the feature or it's not. So I can go back and make use of my current browser and then see if it's supporting it or not. But if you talk about programmatically, as a developer, what should I do? Let's say, for example, if I create an application with HTML5 and that uses some latest features, and what if I view that website on I11, Internet Explorer 11. So if I've used input type equal to date, let's say, if I've used input type equal to date, and if that is going to be viewed in, because I as a developer do not have any control over the end user's browser that he is going to use in. He may be using IE5, IE6, IE7, IE8, for example, or IE11 as well, right? Or he may be using the latest browsers, which are Chrome and things, but I cannot expect. So I have to be prepared for, as a developer, I have to be prepared for the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is browser not supporting that feature. So how do I deal with this limited support of the features in some of the browsers? Now for that, there are two ways. One, you can use a feature detection engine that's called as Modernizer, and that's what we're going to talk about next. And second is you can use some polyfills. Right? So polyfills are some things like they are ultimately JS files which allow you to understand and detect, okay, these features are not supported by your browsers by default, so I would kick in. So you are polyfilling. You are filling the gaps. You are filling the road gaps which are there between your expectation of your application that the browser should be supporting and the browser which is not supporting it. Fine. So you are filling the gap, and that's why it's called as polyfill. So it's just going to go back and have that support being given out of the box. Right. Now we're going to see the first part, which is how do I know freehand as a developer that whether the end user's browser is supporting this feature or not. Right. So that is what is an important part of a web developer, because when you're working with HTML5, you need to understand that the browsers which are older browsers do not support all the features. Right. So as a developer, I have a library which is called as a feature detection library, and the library name is Modernizer. So let's have a look at this Modernizer. So if you search in Google for Modernizer, so what this Modernizer is a feature detection library for HTML5 and CSS3. So what was HTML5 test.com? It was not a detector, it only gave you the score for the current browser. This Modernizer is a feature detection library. So that's something which is going to be, so when your application loads, when your HTML page loads into the browser, it's going to programmatically check what version of the browser you're using and what features your browser supports. Right? So if you open up this Modernizer, which is the feature detection library, So you can see respond to your user's browser features. Modernizer tells you what your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript features the user's browser has to offer, right? And how do you do that? You do it by using this Modernizer. So what does this Modernizer do? What is Modernizer? It's a collection of super fast tests, or what they call as detects, as we like them to call, and which runs as your browser page loads. Then you can use the results to tailor the experience to the user. So what it's saying? It's saying I'm going to detect some feature of the browsers for you, and if your browser supports it, then that's fine. If the browser is not supporting it, maybe you can use some fallback mechanism and fail gracefully. So that's how this Modernizer can work. Now you can have a fallback mechanism as well instead of just failing. Fine, you can just go back and have a different entity being done. So I'm having an application being ready for that. We'll be talking about that in a moment. And why do I need it? Now, as you see, all web developers come up against differences between browsers and devices, right? So some browsers support some of the features, some other browsers do not support. There's a large due to different feature set. The latest versions of the popular browser can do some awesome things which older browsers can't, but we still have to support the older ones. So we can't just expect that the current end user is always using the latest version, right? So we still have to support the older ones. Modernizer makes it easy to deliver tiered experiences. Make use of the latest and the greatest features in the browsers which support them without leaving less fortunate users high and dry, right? So you can still go back and have some fallback mechanism to be done when you use this Modernizer. So let's understand how do we use this Modernizer. Now, this has to have some coding to understand some JavaScript. Now, for those who understand what JavaScript is, they'll be following me along. If not, just understand that this is a feature detection library, and there is something that is Modernizer is going to allow you to perform and check, which is a detect, okay, and then see if something else can be done. Now, what I've done is I'm already referring to this Modernizer as a library. Now, how you can do that? You can refer to the modernizer.js file. So there are different ways. If you want to learn more on the Modernizer, you can go back to the downloads. Fine, you can go back to the documentation as well. Okay, you can refer to what all things you want to add and remove. Okay, you can just go back and have your own build being set up. Fine, but that's a different story. So you have these checks and supports being done. Fine, as you can see in here, and then you can click on build so that you have your own version of the minified version of it. Now they have done it because lesser the detects that you are using, or lesser the features you are using, lesser will be the size of your .js file. So ultimately it's something but a simple .js file. Now for that, now you can also go back and refer to the Modernizer documentation for downloading or having it to be installed using npm as well. So it's present as an npm package. Now for those who have worked with Node, they understand what npm is. So you can install Modernizer as an npm package. npm, which basically stands for the Node Package Manager. Fine. I'm not going to go back into this because that's a very simplest way how you can refer by using a .js file, and that's what I'm going to do. Now I've already created an application. So if you have a look at it, I'm just going to open up. Now, most of the terms which you see are same what we did yesterday. Fine, so we have the doc type HTML, we have the HTML lang as en, we have the head, we have body, and I have used this date input type. So type is equal to date is what I have written. Fine. Now this input tag that I've written, input type equal to date, is something which should actually be giving me a calendar. Now I'm focusing on this example just to let you know that if at all your browser does not support this input type equal to date, then what you can do. Now, without telling you what is the code inside this, if I just right click and open it with a live server. So if you remember yesterday, we installed this live server as a plugin. So when you install Visual Studio Code, you can just go back into the plugin section and you can install your live server from here, and that's how this extension will be added to your Visual Studio Code. So if I right click and say open with live server, if I open it with it, you can see you have input type date supported Fine. It means if I just zoom, if I click on it, there is a calendar that's being popped out. Now, this is one of the feature of HTML5 and it's common feature of HTML. Now, why it's a new feature of HTML5 and why it was not present earlier in HTML versions? Because it was not expected that people should have something as a calendar from HTML by default, from the web by default. But as we discussed on, as the web evolved and we had our websites to be graduating to web applications, we implemented real world applications. So we wanted to book a ticket on the website rather than going out to a counter and doing it. We wanted to have real-time implementation, like I want to transfer some amount using net banking from one account to another account. I don't have to go to the bank. So these are web applications and I can use calendar control as a very common control across these applications, and these calendar controls allow you to select a particular date, right? Now earlier we used to have server-side calendars, right? With ASP.NET we used to have server-side calendars where when you click on the text box the calendar would pop out, but every change in the date would post the page back to the server and refresh the page, which is obviously not a good user experience. Now if I'm selecting something, I'm not refreshing my page, I'm only selecting the date to be different, and that's it. So this input type equal to date is supported by your Chrome. If I see this in other browsers like Firefox, Mozilla, if I just paste, I'll just use, yep, right. So you can see input type date supported, and here you would see that's a date calendar being popped out for selecting a date. Now this difference you will also observe that the way how calendar is shown in your Firefox is different than the calendar shown in your Chrome, right? Because every site, as I've told you, has a different rendering engine, okay, and it has a different way of showing that particular item inside it, right? Now if suppose I'm specifically saying, okay, these are the browsers that you displayed the input type equal to date which are supporting input type equal to date. What if I want to make use of IE? So in this IE, if I try to go back and have my input type equal to date being mentioned, fine, you see, if I just paste, right, the input type equal to date by default is not supported. So what I've done, I've used Modernizer, that if the date, you did not see the pop-up, if you see here, you can see a pop-up, input type date supported, and I click on OK. You saw the same pop-up when we work with Mozilla as well. So if I'm just refreshing, you see input type equal to date supported, because that's what Modernizer did. It detected whether the browser is supporting it or not. But in Internet Explorer, if I just try to refresh, you do not get the pop-up, the alert message, because your Internet Explorer has failed the detection in your Modernizer. But if it's a browser's mistake of not supporting, or it's a deficiency of the browser not supporting the input type equal to date, has the application to suffer? And the answer is no. As I said, using Modernizer, you can have some fallback mechanism, and that fallback mechanism, I've done it by using Jquery. Okay? You don't have to understand all of this, but at least what I want you to understand as a beginner, as a web developer, is HTML5 provides you different features. Different browsers supports these features. For the browsers who do not support these features, we as developer need to take care of it. And I'm going to do this by using a Modernizer as a feature detection library. So what I've done, a fallback mechanism I've used as a fallback mechanism, that is Jquery. So Jquery is a library which allows you to use some widgets. It's again a JavaScript library, same as Modernizer. It's a .js file. So it allows you to use widgets, and again allow you to have widgets which are client-side widgets. So what I've done, I've used an Jquery calendar control, a calendar widget, if the browser is not supporting it. So if you have a look at the code, that's what it is. Now I'm just going to explain you what it is. You don't have to entirely understand everything, but here you would see I am having a reference to modernizer.js. Here I'm having a reference to jquery.js. Here I'm having a reference to jquery min.js and also CSS file for giving some styling. These are some mandatory steps which you need to have if you want to have that fallback mechanism to be done. It's not mandatory that you have to use jQuery. You can also use some other libraries as well, which can allow you to work with the calendar control. Now, how do you detect? How does the Modernizer understand if your browser is supporting it? It is done by writing some code, some script. Fine, as we discussed on yesterday, the script tag is a tag where we write some programming logic. Fine. Here, this is the code that we have used to detect if Modernizer dot input types dot date, which are again predefined with this Modernizer object. Now, where do you get this Modernizer object from? You got it from the modernizer.js. And in this modernizer.inputtypes.date, if that is true, then I would just alert a simple message. So it is supported. So if this returns true, alert message will be popped out. So your Chrome and your Firefox went ahead and showed this alert message. And if it is not, then what I'm doing is I'm just accessing this text box and I'm just using this date picker as a widget. So jQuery widgets are something which are exposing the things using your API. So just saying $hash of txt date, which is basically selecting this input type equal to date by its ID. ID is a unique identifier, and dot date picker is the method which will allow it to understand, okay, this is the element where the calendar must be shown. Now if I just come back to my Internet Explorer, fine, if I just refresh, now if I just click onto it, you will see a calendar being popped up. Now this is not a standard HTML5 calendar, because if you have a look at in the Chrome, I'll just pin it. Now if you have a look at Chrome, find here on the left hand side, that's how Chrome things look like, but this is jQuery, fine, whereas this is your input type equal to date. So at least we have not gone ahead and failed our web application where the web browser did not support that feature, but we actually had a fallback mechanism where we can at least allow user, okay, if this is not supported, I'm giving a fallback mechanism to select a particular date out of the calendar. Now for the end user, it does not matter whether input type equal to date is supported by the current browser or not. It's not his concern, it's the developer's job. So you as a developer have to take care of it. And here we have just used this HTML5 input type equal to date with browsers, and for browsers like Internet Explorer 11 that does not support input type equal to date, we have solved it by using Modernizer, right, which is a feature detection library. Right, so let's come back to the presentation. Fine. So let's recap what we have seen. So what we discussed today is how we got here with HTML5 as the version. So we discussed on the evolution of the web, different versions of HTML, okay, right from 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we also saw the 5.x version also being evolving with some minor features being added, minor versions being created for it. Then we had new features of HTML5, and new features of HTML5 were segregated in two parts, one with JS, second without the JS. Third, we talked about current state of the browser support, where browser gives you some support for HTML5 features and which browser is supporting what features. So we saw two ways. One is manually seeing by going back to html5test.com, which will allow you to know whether the browser is supporting the current feature or not. And then as a developer's tool, we saw Modernizer, which is a feature detection library that can tell you if HTML5 features are supported by the current browsers or not. So it can do it at runtime, whereas html5test.com is just going to give it for that particular time that you're viewing the browser thing in. So using Modernizer is always a better practice from a developer standpoint, because that's his tool and he will be managing whether the browser is supporting the feature or not. Right? So that's what we talked about in today's session. Right. So thank you all for joining in. Please do not forget to like and subscribe. Meet you tomorrow in session 3 at 5:30. Thank you.